chapter 13 and verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beasts. So he gives us, he leaves the riddle to the readers. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beasts, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now in chapter 13, look at verse 2 now. Verse 1, for instance, it says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems its own and blasphemous names on its heads." And verse 2 says, "And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and its feet like a bear." So it takes us back in the Old Testament, takes back to in Daniel. But the beast of chapter 13 is more like a combination of all those beasts that you get in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, because none of those beasts in the book of Daniel has 7 heads. The only one which has got 4 heads is the 4th one. Now the combination of all of them is the beast of of Revelation. 7 heads together and 10 horns. And then when you get to verse 3, it says one of its heads, seems to have a mortal wound. Then he leaves it. He doesn't tell us which one of these. In verse 3. So this is a remarkable and important event in Revelation 13 too, but because of his stylistic way of writing, John doesn't want to give us what he means by, the meaning of the wound here and the fatal wounds, and he doesn't want to give us at this point who is he referring to. He leaves this until chapter 17. How do we know? It's because of the literary connection that he makes between chapter 13 and 17, because these are the 2 great chapters of beastology in Revelation. Okay? So some of the details that he spares his reader in chapter 13, he is going to bring them in chapter 17 so that we have clarity of what he meant by the beast in chapter 13. So chapter 13 verse 2, one of the heads has a fatal wound, and then in the same chapter, in the same verse it said, "But its mortal wound was healed." So he's referring to that legend, the one I said, the Nero Redivivus, the return of Nero. Now, it doesn't bring it so explicit that he's talking about Nero here, and he wants to use him to explain about the eschatological evil that is always a reality of this period of time. So he is going to bring the ideas, the connections in chapter 17. So look at 13 verse 3. He leaves us in suspense, and then when we get to the last verse of the chapter, again he says, "This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has an understanding calculate the number of the beasts, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, 17, verse 9. Verse 9. So the literal connection is there. This calls for a mind with wisdom. So he's expecting his readers, to connect. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, and on which the woman is seated. Now here, he wants to tell us what he didn't in chapter 13. So he explains about the 7, because in chapter 13, all he tells us in 13 is that the beast has got 7 heads. What's the meaning? He says, hold on, I will explain in chapter 17. Okay? And what about the fatal wound? What are you talking about in chapter 17? He gives us the understanding. The meaning is talking about kings. And then he explains now the beasts in that verse. Look at verse 9 now. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. And verse 10, There are also 7 kings. That's what it says. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. He is expecting his readers to understand and get them. And sorry, it says, yes, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain a little while. Verse 11, as for the beasts, that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it also belongs to the 7. So now is what he left in chapter 13, just as a riddle in 666, in 18, in chapter 17, he wants the people to understand he's talking about Nero. He belongs to the 7, but is also the 8th one. And the reason why he makes a connection between 7 and 8 is because of the peculiarity of number 666, which is a doubling number, a number which is a triangular number of 36, which is also a triangular number of 8. Remember what we said? Triangular number of 8. And so he uses now the principle of the 8th. So Nero is no more. Nero is coming. It's another way of explaining what he left in Revelation 13, verse 2, verse 3, about the fatal wound, and the wound is healed. Just like what he does in chapter 7 of Revelation, he uses the idea of sealing the 1,044. And in 11, because he's still talking about the 144 in another symbolic way, because the 144 is the people of God in chapter 7. Now he changes the symbol, the imagery in chapter 11. He doesn't use 144. He uses the imagery of a sanctuary, the temple that is supposed to be measured, right? So now it changes, but the meaning is conveying is the same. If the 1,044, they are sealed, now the temple is measured. So the sealing and the measuring convey the same meaning of protecting, and also the sanctuary and 144 is the same meaning, the people of God. Here in chapter 13, he's talking about the beast, and he brings in the idea of having a fatal wound and the wound is healed. That concept of the wound and healing of the wound, which brings to mind the idea of the return of Nero that was circulating during that time. Now, the moment he comes to chapter 17, which is another major passage of the beast, he changes the imagery. Instead of talking about the healing, now he's talking about the idea of the beast I'm talking about is one of the 7, which is already gone, and is also the 8th who is coming. So the same concept of the return, and he's expecting the readers to associate this with the legend that was circulating of the return of Nero, which John does not believe literally that Nero is going to come. John picks it and he uses the theology of explaining the fact that whatever you expect, whatever you know about evil in Nero is still the reality that is going to come. Remember that, that element of the intensity of persecution, we don't normally get it in every section. But when you get to section 3, chapter 8 to chapter 11, especially chapter 11 with the 2 witnesses, the elements of the intensity of persecution and tribulation at the end of time is very clear there. You know, that's where we get, instead of using 1,260 days, which is this period of time, but as we approach the end of time, changes from 1,260 days to 3 days enough. So it's talking about how the devil and the of evil during this period of time, they've been trying by all means to silence the witnessing of the people of God, and they will never They will never manage. How do they do it? Through persecution and also through false teaching. The beast out of the sea and the beast out of the land. But they will never manage to silence the church until, as we approach the end time, it will be so intensive. Much that in the symbolic way of the killing of the two, killing them is like silencing the witnesses of the church because of the pressure of persecution. But tribulation has always been a reality of church age. What I appreciate about your question, number one, is the fact that you have an idea of the biblical theology, so you understand the progress of the Messiah and the conflict that is a reality, because we already have the people of God in the Old Testament. We can say, in a certain way, we can say the church of the Old Testament, in a way, and then the people of God, even in the Old Testament, are always persecuted. Always, there's that persecution going on, right? And then when we come to New Testament, so finally the Messiah is there in the New Testament. And now the question is, are we expecting finally the Antichrist now? This is the question, right? But again, who is going to give us that answer? The New Testament writers have their own way of understanding that. Okay, so I don't have the right to follow that trend of thoughts and say he's going to come. We need to ask the writers of the New Testament, how do you understand these books we are dealing with, Hebrews, all the way to Revelation? They've given us the answer already that do not expect one figure, So 1 John says it, Peter says it, even 1 John says, you've been hearing people saying the Antichrist. Let me tell you, he's talking on authoritative ground. They are already here. He came and they are already here. We always have them. So the most important thing now when it comes to the figure of the Antichrist is not necessarily about the person. It's about what is happening in terms of persecuting believers, which necessarily may come through a particular person, but we cannot single out that particular person and say, this is the Antichrist. Very intelligent question. Thank you so much. Now, let's go back to chapter 17. This is what he says. He says, the beast that you saw was, and verse 8, was and is not, is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction, and the dwellers on earth, remember the dwellers on earth, the followers of the beast, the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation. Verse 10. There are also 7 kings. First, verse 9, it says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. This is another clue. It's not just kings. There are 7 mountains. So he wants them to think of Rome, which was built on 7 hills. So the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain holy. So the problem with the interpretation of expecting a king is that John is just saying that her kings. Is giving us also another clue that it's also an empire, it's an institution. Okay, because he doesn't not only say the 7 kings, the 7 heads are kings, like he was very much specific about the lampstands. On the lampstand, he just gave us one clue to say, when you see lampstand, think of the church, the people of God. But when you see the 7 heads, don't just think of kings, think also of the 7 years. This is what it says in verse 9. So the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. It's very symbolic. And then he goes on verse 10. Not only that, there are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. So, first of all, he has given us 2 ways of understanding this. To give us details is because he wants to explain what he left unexplained in chapter 13. His main point is to tell us, I want you to know the nature of the beast. Now, when we read, we should know the focus of the reader and how significant it is, so that we may not shift and trying to emphasize where he doesn't want to emphasize. So the purpose of chapter 17, which is the second passage of the beast, is to tell us the nature of the beast of chapter 13, who he is. And that's why it takes us back. Verse 11 says, now as for the beast, the reason why it takes them to the 7 kings, because his readers will be able to relate that he's talking about someone they know and the legend that was already circulating, and he picks that one and he brings his theology of the eschatological evil that we'll expect in every generation. Okay. Now, if we get stuck and trying to look for one individual, we are somehow misreading him, because 17 is a text that is explaining 13 for those connections. So it's more on the symbolic side rather than expecting a king. Because what he says is like all the 7 they are already gone, but he knows that you are expecting the coming of Nero. And then he picks that one. He says, actually, Nero is the one I meant in chapter 13, is coming, but in a more symbolic way of persecution. There is a theology of the beast as the parody of the Messiah, which is very prevalent in the book of Revelation, and the language of who was, is, and is to come, and the Trinitarian aspects of our God and the book of Revelation, and how also the beasts. There's a lot of that. It's an irony, actually. I believe it's just because we don't have time to unpack everything there in this passage, but it's not something implicit in my view. It's very explicit, because it's not the only time it does refer to that. Even in my thesis, the fact that the word sphezo, which means slaughter, the fact that John has used it also on the beast is because of the beast is a parody of the Messiah. It's a parody of the Messiah, because in Revelation theology, slaughter is not something you apply on evil. So the slaughtered ones is either the Messiah who is slaughtered 4 times in Revelation, or the followers of the Messiah, because the followers of the Messiah, they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Because they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, they are identified with their Messiah, even in the slaughter. Now, he takes the same idea of the slaughter and on the beast, because the beast in Revelation is the parody of the Messiah. As the people of God, as the church, the people of God, yes, there's a lot. First of all is 17. Chapter 7, it says, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea, and against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising sun, the seal, and so forth. And let's go to verse 3, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, and the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God. And these servants of our God, they are 1,044. They are known as the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. So before we go through there, go to chapter 14. Because chapter 7 it is part of this section, and they are all parallel. And now we are in chapter 14, which is another parallel. In chapter 14, this is what it says about the 144. And verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000. So you see the association of the 144,000 with the Lamb, with Christ, and add his name. They've got the name of the Lamb. and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roll of many waters and like the sound of the loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. The idea of redemption, they've been redeemed from the earth. And it is these who have not defiled themselves with women, and they are virgins, and it is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. That's the church, that's the people of God. Okay? These have been redeemed from mankind, and they're the first fruits. You see from the theology of the New Testament, this is how the church is portrayed in the New Testament as the first fruits. Now you can see that in the Pauline letters, you can see that in the Hebrews, the church as the first fruits. For God, not only for God, also in the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So the way they are described in chapter 14 and their connection with the Lamb, number one, their idea of them being redeemed, their association of the name of the Lamb on their foreheads and so forth and so on, it shows that these are the people of God, this is the church. The second answer I can give you is, let's go back to chapter 7. It is the literary technique of John. Remember, John, most of the time, what he sees may explain what he hears, and what he hears may explain what he sees. So in chapter 7, after this, I saw 4 angels. And then in verse 3, in verse 4, it says, and I heard the number of the sealed. And then there's a list of them. Now in verse 9, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number. Remember the structure of up and down? Up and down, back and forth. So when he's talking about 144,000, he introduces like this is the church militant. They are on earth. The church militant on earth. Now, verse 9 all the way to the end, the same people now, they are the church triumphant. They are now up there in heaven. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number. From every nation, from all tribes, and from all people. So it's John's way of saying what I heard, the 144. It is these same people that no one can number. From another perspective, here they are on earth as a church militant, and here now in verse 9, they are church triumphant. Because there's a question, one of the angels would ask, where are these coming from? And the answer is, these are the same guys, the ones that were on earth, the 144,000. Now, from this perspective, they have overcome. It is one and the same people. Apart from that, how many times, dear friends, we have the theology of continuity, that the Israel in the Old Testament, now the church in the New Testament, the people of God, there's that continuity that the people of God now, the Laos that we mentioned earlier on, is now the people of God. Okay? This is one. This is 4. Number 3 is, and number 4 is, there's a lot of symbolic. John knew that during his time, even now, these tribes were not in existence. These tribes were not in existence. So they disappeared and got scattered during the dispersion. So John is not talking about the literal Israel because they were not there. And then number 2, you see that there's symbolically Dan is not here, the tribe of Dan, and also Ephraim is not here. All these he expects us to get it in a symbolic way rather than literal Israel. He's talking about the spiritual Israel, the people of God, and even the numbering there is to give us a connotation of an army, because this is what you get in the Old Testament. So you go through, you number people, to show the force, the military force, and the connotation that we get from them. So it's symbolic of the people of God here. It's not first time that John uses I hear and I see to explain the same thing. many times in here. And the structure itself shows that it's just taking us back and forth, even up and down. So the 144 is when you look at the people of God as the church militants on earth, and the great multitude is when you look at the same people of God as the church triumphant. Back to the biblical theology. It's a good question. Back again, biblical theology is if in Jeremiah Israel is referred as the New Testament, as first fruits. When you are this side of the cross, it's a fundamental question all the time to ask, now that Jesus has come, how do I understand that? The New Testament writers have already told us that now that Jesus has come, whenever you want to think about first fruits, don't think of Israel. Think of the people of God. There are a lot of passages in the New Testament now referring to the people of God as a church, as first fruits, not Israel. Because there's progression of the story. The story did not end in Jeremiah. The Bible is progressing. Now that we are on this side of the cross, the New Testament writers themselves, they will tell us what do they understand by first fruits, now that Jesus has come. A good question all the time. Whenever you read a story in the Old Testament, the question is, how do I understand this same story now that the Lord Jesus Christ has come? So instead of beginning to speculate, we get information from the New Testament writers themselves. There are so many passages that will describe the people of God, the church, where you and I belong as a first fruits. Okay, let me do one more thing before we close. I promised to say, let's go through the number 7 and number 10. Numbers 7 and number 10 associated with the beast in Revelation. So these are the numbers of the heads and horns of the beast in chapter 13, verse 1, chapter 17, verse 3. That John's beast has 7 heads. You don't get a beast of 7 heads in Daniel. And the beast of John in Revelation has 10 horns. Result from the fact that it combines, the beast of Revelation combines the characteristics of all the 4 beasts of Daniel's vision. So it sums up and surpasses, the beast of Revelation sums up and surpasses the evil empire of history in itself. Yeah, so let's wind up with this point. Yeah, so these are the numbers. So now let's talk about the 7. I was saying these are the numbers of the heads and the horns of the beast in Revelation 13, verse 1, and Revelation 17, verse 3. So the beast of the book of Revelation has 7 heads and 10 horns, result from the fact that it combines the characteristics of all the 4 beasts of Daniel's vision. So what it means is it sums up and it surpasses the evil empires of history in itself. So Daniel's 4 beasts have 7 heads between them, since the 4th has 4, while none has horns except the 4th one, which has 10. So nevertheless, John would not have given his beasts 7 and 10 horns purely for this reason. He's an independent theologian. He's got an aim that he wants to achieve, and then he's free to use this symbolism in a way that it would fit the purpose that he has. So he uses the imagery he takes over from Daniel fairly, very freely. He does not, for example, take over the 4 wings that we get in Daniel. For the 4th beast in Daniel has 4 wings, but he leaves that out. He doesn't get it, for which he evidently had no symbolic use for him. Whereas Daniel's individual Antichrist figure is one of the 10 horns. That's what he put it in Daniel chapter 7. But for John, he's talking about the beast, one of the heads of the beast, not the horn, when he's talking about the Antichrist. Now the 7 heads and the 10 crowned horns link the beast with its master and source of the power, and the dragon in chapter 12. We've already noted the equation of the 7 heads of the beast with the 7 hues of Rome, and with 7 kings, of which one is also one of the 7 who's the 8th in chapter 17, verse 9 to 11. Now here, the number 7 is linked to the number 8 in chapter 17, whose relationship to 666, again, as an eschatological symbolism we have already explored. So the last one is, but there's a little more to be said about this use of the number 7 in connection with 8. So when it, I think it's actually one of the questions I got yesterday, that number 7 does not just mean perfection, but it can also mean totality or completeness. Yeah, especially when it applies to something evil. It's not about perfection, it's about something in its totality. 7 is the number of totality. It's sometimes said to be the number of perfection, but if it is meant to indicate value rather than simply quantity, it is misleading and would make it puzzling that John gives evil powers, the dragon and the beast and 7 heads, no perfection. 7 is better understood as the number of totality. Friends, we've gone a long way with us. Thank you very much.